The revolutionary new capital of Egypt, Akhetaten, that is, horizon of the sun in ancient Egyptian, or in modern Arabic, Tel el Amarna, illustrates two tendencies in city foundation familiar to us from their application in the United States. First, it marks the deliberate creation of a capital as close as possible to the center of the kingdom. In Amarna's case, along the edge of the Nile, about midway between Thebes and the south, that is the New Kingdom capital, and Memphis in the north, the Old Kingdom capital. We see this geographically based founding of state capitals in areas such as Columbus, Ohio, or Indianapolis, Indiana, Jefferson City, Missouri, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and Little Rock, Arkansas. These are all placed in the geographical center of their respective states. And they make a statement, I think, about the centrality of state government and of that capital. This city, Amarna, as it's commonly referred, also demonstrates the type of planned layout and buildings based on the ideology of rule. We see this, I think, best in Washington, D.C. Washington was an attempt to create a capital that reflected the new Republican layout and its foundations from the Greek and Roman governments and the Greek and Roman inspired buildings that in particular monumentalized the three branches of government. And this was deliberate and in direct contrast to royal capitals such as London, where royal palaces were the largest buildings in government. And so we've got an ideological layout in D.C. This is the type of thinking that went into the creation of the city of Amarna. Now, Amarna was an administrative and religious foundation conceived of as an attempt to break the hold of the priests of Amun-Ra on the life of Egypt and to redirect religious and political authority to the pharaoh himself. The pharaoh who founded this new capital was Amenhotep IV, but he's better known to us in history as Akhenaten, the name he took when he began to rule in his own right. He very radically abandoned the worship of Amun-Ra as he abandoned the name of Amenhotep, that is, Amun is pleased, and selected the name that he chose, Akhenaten. See, pharaohs before him, for hundreds of years, had exploited the worship of Amun-Ra by declaring themselves to be the sons of Amun-Ra. And because of that, they built onto the god's temple complex at Thebes, what is in modern terms Luxor and Karnak. These constructions, which started in the Middle Kingdom and continued into the New Kingdom, eventually made this complex of Amun-Ra the largest religious sanctuary ever created in the history of the world. And I don't mean just up to that time. I mean even to today. It's the largest religious sanctuary ever found in the history of the world. If you go to Thebes today and visit Luxor and Karnak, pack a lunch. You'll be there for days wandering around the complex. It's immense. It's hard to take in. But that complex was more than a religious sanctuary. It was an economic zone. There was a reason that the striking workers I discussed in the lecture on Deir el-Medina headed to the nearest temple of Amun-Ra to press their complaint. The estate of Amun, as the land controlled by the temple complex at Thebes was called, was a major center for growing, storing, and distributing food, particularly grain, in ancient Egypt. And food, of course, was not just food. Well, yeah, not just food. It was the means of exchange. It was the way salaries were paid and wealth was created. This practice of using the temples as economic zones and as food distribution centers gave the priests of Amun-Ra immense power and control. Mostly at the main temple at Luxor Karnak, but also at its associated temples across the kingdom. Remember, the striking workers from Deir el-Medina didn't go across the river to Karnak. They went to the local temple of Amun-Ra, their local administrative and food distribution center. And so we've got this remarkable structured hierarchy of priests, thousands of priests of Amun-Ra spread throughout the kingdom, controlling not just the most important religious observance, but also the economy throughout all of Egypt. Well, Akhenaten closed the temples of Amun-Ra and redirected worship from Amun-Ra to a new deity, the Aten, that is the sun disk, the physical disk of the sun. Rather than requiring the intercession of hundreds or thousands of priests, as the worship of Amun-Ra did, the sun disk's blessings flow directly down. They flow to the royal family and from them to their subjects across the kingdom, making Akhenaten and his immediate family the only intermediaries needed for the entire kingdom and its citizens to thrive. It's a social and religious revolution. Because of this radical shift to the pharaoh as the only intermediary between humans and the primary god of the sun disk, the Aten, many images of the royal couple, Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti, were created, and they've been found really throughout the city of Amarna in both public buildings and domestic spaces, including common houses, almost every common house, and tombs. Now, the masterpiece of this revolution in religion and society is the new capital at Akhetaten, or as we'll refer to it from now on by its modern Arabic name, Amarna. At the selected location, central in the kingdom, along the banks of the Nile, a plot of land about 8 by 10 miles, or 13 by 16 kilometers, was surveyed, and it's marked out with a series of limestone stelae. These are freestanding stones that mark the edges, the boundaries of this great rectangular area. Each one of these stones is carved with an image of Akhenaten and Nefertiti worshiping the Aten. And the city they constructed was unlike any ever seen before, and I think rarely seen since. Normally cities, as we saw at Kahun, were founded to a set plan. They pull out the plan, they set down the city, and there you go. Or, alternately, as with cities like Pompeii or Barcelona, they begin organically. People grow their community in a small area, and then as they grow, order is imposed as regular, usually orthogonal planning is created into new areas as the city expands. So you start out organic and move to orthogonal planning. At Amarna, the city was laid out along a main road in a pattern designed to emphasize that road's use as a setting for royal procession. Only the core of the center of the city was orthogonally planned. That core included only the central palace and the sanctuary of the Aten, the largest complex in the city. The sanctuary was laid out directly across the main road from the palace with a bridge connecting the two over the main road. This core of palace and sanctuary was a stage for pharaonic power and for rituals that were designed to reinforce the pharaoh's connection to the Aten and to remind everyone of the benefits that flowed through him to all of the people of Egypt. Other than this core, the remainder of the buildings are placed organically. That is, they're not aligned to that palace temple complex. This is exactly the opposite of what we see at Pompeii or Barcelona, as I explained earlier. This organic construction includes both government buildings, such as the barracks of the police and the soldiers, religious buildings, such as subsidiary shrines to the Aten, and the houses. Most remarkably, the houses, because these are built in sprawling groups. They're not rigidly controlled, as at Deir el-Medina, and they're not enclosed within walls, like we saw at Kahun. These organic placements are not the result of later building of suburbs onto a sprawling city. They're not the result of a lack of control. They are, in fact, all laid out and built here in a matter of just a few years around 1350 BC. What they represent is that Akhenaten's revolution involved a radical change in society. The pattern seems clearly designed to break the power of the hereditary priesthoods of Amun-Ra and of the aristocracy in favor of new groups of individuals chosen perhaps for loyalty, but more likely and intriguingly for ability. It's an attempt to restructure society below the pharaoh, around merit, without regard for birth. This is the first such revolution we know of in world history, and the city of Amarna preserves the evidence for it. The temples of the Aten were designed superficially like the great temples of Amun-Ra. There are processional routes, and the temple moves into a series of increasingly restricted spaces as only the most elite continued to move into the temple until the final room in the center where personal contact with the god took place. And into that, we believe only the pharaoh moved. Here at Amarna, however, as befits a temple of the sun disk, the entire complex is open to the sky. It's unroofed, unlike the traditional temples. All of the worship occurs in the open, and the sacrifices and offering tables were laid out in massive courtyards instead of in small enclosed rooms. Between the two temples of the Aten that define the north and south edges of the sanctuary, and adjacent to that main road, we call it the Royal Road, the majority of the frontage of the sanctuary was taken up with enormous areas for slaughtering cattle and for grinding grain and baking bread. This is because the temple of the Aten served to supply rations to the inhabitants of the central part of the city. The pharaoh has taken a page from the playbook of the priests of Amun-Ra. Only now the food for the inhabitants of Amarna comes from the temple of Aten, the benefits of which flow through the pharaoh personally. In addition to celebrating the god Aten, the city was designed as an arena of royal display, best seen, I think, in the city layout, royal architecture, and the art found around the city. That single major road, the Royal Road, is a processional avenue, allowing the pharaoh and his family to be seen moving across the city, particularly back and forth from temple to palace and along the length of the city from north to south, stopping at key locations for open-air audiences. We can think much the way the Pope holds audiences in St. Peter's Square. He comes in, rides around in his car, and moves up onto the grand elevated platform which holds the altar and where Mass is said. In this case, the pharaoh moves in a royal chariot, and this chariot is accompanied by armed escorts whose presence reinforces the royal status. And this is fairly standard in ancient societies. One's status comes from one's retainers, and the more you have around you, the higher status you are. It makes a visual display, a snapshot, if you will, of somebody's importance. There's a famous bas-relief in the tomb of Mahu, the chief of police of Amarna. It shows Akhenaten with his queen Nefertiti traveling by chariot, and Mahu is running ahead with the bodyguard, presumably clearing the route. He's labeled by hieroglyphics, and he seems very proud of his prowess to be able to accompany his master in this way. And he certainly wished to reflect his status by his proximity to the pharaoh, and that's key. The Aten, all his benefits flow to the pharaoh, and from the pharaoh directly to everyone else. What we also find in the art of these audiences are what are called postures of special deference. These are adopted by those who are allowed to approach the pharaoh. And these tell us the status and relationship to the pharaoh of every individual. Some in the audience stand with hands raised in a gesture of adoration or acclamation, just like that, while lower status people bow, or the very lowest status people, in extreme cases, kneel and kiss the ground. So how somebody acts in an audience and how their image is preserved in the art of that audience shows you their place in society, gives you a snapshot of where everybody is. Well, the pharaoh makes regular appearances, as they're called, either alone or with his family to reinforce their eventual succession, because he's creating a dynasty here. These appearances either occur at a palace balcony. Again, I think of the Pope, appearing in his balcony for his regular Wednesday audiences, or at what's called the window of appearances. That window is in the center of the bridge that links the palace and the temple complex, so that the road beneath operates as an open-air audience hall. It's the pharaoh's road, so I guess he can clog it up whenever he wants like this. He appears there and everybody gathers down below. Open-air reviews of troops and representatives of empire also take place to reinforce the direct connection between the pharaoh and critical components of society, such as the military. One relief in a tomb shows a soldier being decorated for service, with the royal family overseeing the ceremony from the window of appearances. To give you a sense of how remarkable that is, normally audiences with a pharaoh would have occurred in a throne room, indoors, exclusive space. Here, Akhenaten is under the Aten, under the sun disk, and making a statement about his benefits pouring out to everyone in public, the entire community, not just those restricted spaces in the palace. Public or semi-public acts of worship occurred also to establish the pharaoh's role as mediator between the Aten and his kingdom. Pictures of the leader, Akhenaten, alone or with his family, are found in shrines in many of the common people's own houses. By many, I mean almost all. All of these events and activities take place in the architectural stage created by the city of Amarna. Now, in sharp contrast to the royal and religious areas that I just described, the orthogonally planned ones, as well as in contrast to previous practice, the non-royal housing and other public buildings in the city display a lack of modular construction and a rejection of unit building. The vast majority of the 45,000 inhabitants lived in small neighborhoods that combined both upper status and common housing. Think about how different this is from Kahun, where these two classes, upper status, the overseers and the common people, were restricted from one another. Here, there seems to have been a complete intermixing, with no formal divisions or distinctions, and most notably, no surrounding walls. And I think, again, Kahun provides the greatest contrast. For here in Amarna, there's not even a wall surrounding the entire community, let alone one isolating the workers from the elites and from the food warehouses. Amarna seems to represent a radical reconfiguring of both the traditional class system and urban design. With no walls, there's nothing to restrict access to food, to define status, or to create social controls by keeping the workers in their place. The arrangement of the residential space in the center of Amarna shows a new form of society. Now, you might think, well, to yourself, Kahun was over 500 years earlier. Wouldn't we expect there to be some developments in, social forms or in urban development in that time? No, the short answer is not. In sharp contrast to the development of the city of Amarna is the initial workers' village, and I think this is worth taking a look at. It seems to have been the first settlement here for those workers who were initially sent to build the city and to begin to dig and decorate the rock-cut tombs in the cliffs on the edge of the plain. The village, this initial workers' village, is a carryover from previous periods of Egyptian society, and it reflects the social organization of the reigns before Akhenaten. It would seem familiar to any inhabitant of Kahun over 500 years earlier. It consists of a rectangle surrounded by a wall within which there are 6 rows of common houses. Each row is 12 houses long, and there's a large house for an overseer in one corner of the village. It reflects traditional Egyptian society. It's rigidly class-based and tightly controlled. And I think it demonstrates brilliantly that the new urban forms in the community of Amarna were deliberate and not merely the latest trend. They occur rapidly and they occur deliberately over a period of about 3 years. The houses in the non-royal areas of Amarna demonstrate the extent of social revolution that Akhenaten visualized. They're not in regular orthogonal arrangements, nor are they modular in design, nor isolated by class or status. Instead, loose arrangements of houses for a variety of social levels were placed in really heterogeneous groups. I have to tell you that we don't understand the grouping. We don't know if people are living together by profession, that is, by their craft. If all the sculptors are in one place and all the bead makers are in one place and the potters are in another, or quite possibly they could be living together in groups based on where they are assigned. So you might have a mixed group of potters and furniture makers and so on who are assigned to one area of the city. Or it could be something completely different. It could be family-based. We simply don't know. Nevertheless, it's an arrangement that violates the principles of previous Egyptian city design and reveals the breakdown of social and cultural constraints on class. While it's difficult to know for sure, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think these are loose configurations that represent class specializations rather than kinship groups or a narrow subset of class as at Deir el-Medina. In other words, we have a mixed group of people who are all in the same craft from the very highest levels to the lowest, all in one area. Now, the most obvious example of the radical nature of the housing in Amarna is in the houses of the new middle class. Unlike at Kahun or Deir el-Medina, they have their own food storage facilities. Now, we all live in houses probably or apartments with pantries and kitchen cabinets, and you think, ooh, food storage facilities. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal here is the scale of these food storage facilities. Either these people are receiving surplus rations so that they have to store about 270 bushels or about 9,500 liters of grain, or, and this is the most exciting possibility, and the one that I think is actually most likely, the authorities are storing the annual harvest, in this case about 10 acres worth of grain, in the houses of non-royal and arguably non-elite members of the community. It's a radical departure from what we've seen before. That in itself is surprising and radical. But even more remarkably, these houses, or small estates, are full economic zones. They are essentially almost independent complexes with their own wells for water, their own granaries, stables, courtyards, gardens, shrines, and most importantly for the social revolution, workshops. The contrast to Deir el-Medina under Akhenaten's father is dramatic. In that city, the workers lived in the gangs that they worked in. They were tightly controlled, apparently supervised in their work as they left the city in shifts, and returned together. Here at Amarna, not only are these non-elite compounds rather autonomous, but work, vital work, went on within them, where oversight by higher authorities, such as the king's vizier, would have been practically impossible. You can't supervise everybody who is working at home. Akhenaten has created a city, a society, that demoted the hereditary aristocracy and elevated middle-class craftsmen to exalted positions of power and autonomy. In essence, he seems to have created a society based on merit. Gone are the tight central controls over food, water, and movement as a means of controlling workers, which we saw characterizing all previous periods in Egypt. Instead, status seems to come from direct contact or association with the pharaoh himself. He often appeared in public, commending and rewarding subjects, and always appeared in their houses, on the reliefs in their shrines. The result of this visual association is an explosion in remarkable art and construction, which has given us some of the most creative and iconic images from ancient Egypt. These works include the famous bust of Nefertiti, actually found in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, because it was within his large house complex where he worked. The major subjects of the art were the royal family and their role in interacting with the Aten to bring its blessings to all of Egypt. In fact, however, the pharaoh may have been more than the major subject of art. One sculptor, whose name is Beck or Bach, it's a little unclear how to translate it, had carved on his gravestone, which he seems to have carved himself, that the pharaoh himself taught Bach when the sculptor was only an apprentice. Now, we doubt that Akhenaten was teaching sculpture here, but it's very likely that what this indicates is that he directed the subjects and the style of the art of Amarna. And it's a radically different art. It's instantly recognizable. I know this isn't a lecture on art, but when you see it, you recognize it, and it's always recognizable. It stands out from all Egyptian art. And it apparently, according to Bach, comes directly from the person of the pharaoh himself, who trained them to do it. Well, the city of Amarna did not last beyond a generation. With the death of Akhenaten, his religious and social reforms seem to have collapsed completely. The temple of Amun-Ra at Thebes was reopened, and his successor and probable son, Tutankhaten, that is the living image of the Aten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, that is King Tut. Some of the radical social changes that occurred in Amarna, however, are found later, although whether directly inspired by the city or not, it's impossible to say. Still, in subsequent periods and upcoming lectures, we'll note the rise of this house-workshop complex in Greek and Roman cities, and how later cities reflect the social changes that swept over other civilizations, a pattern recognizable for the first time in world history here in the capital at Amarna. Having explored cities in Asia, from the Indus Valley in the east all the way through southwestern Asia and into Africa, and from the Neolithic down into the late Bronze Age, we're next going to cross into the Mediterranean world. There we'll follow the development of urban forms from the east to the west. And this is not, I believe, an artificial direction. I think this is, in fact, the direction that influences flowed. And in order to first explore that, we're going to begin in the island of Crete, the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, the place in which, in fact, the Greeks believed civilization flowed from the east to them. On Crete, we'll examine another Bronze Age community of the period of Amarna, but of a type never before seen in the history of urban development. Its similar appearance to the Assyrian palaces of the Near East, of Mesopotamia, led the excavators to call it a palace. But the city of Knossos is something very different. It's not a palace at all. It's a new form of urban organization. And like the Indus Valley civilizations, it was constructed by a culture whose language and writing system we still do not understand.